Hi and welcome to episode 26 of Beating BDD, a podcast about body dysmorphic disorder from the BDD Foundation in the UK. I'm your host Claire Atherton, and for this episode I spoke to the inspirational George Mycock, who suffered for a long time with what he terms muscularity-oriented issues. Sometimes known as muscle dysmorphia, muscle dysmorphic disorder, or even bigorexia. This form of BDD brings its own challenges in terms of social stigma, as well as diagnosis and treatment. George shares his lived experience, dips into the huge amount of knowledge he's gained, and explains why he's made it his life's work to raise awareness and improve treatment of these issues. I hope you enjoy his interview. Hi George, thanks a million for joining us on Beating BDD. It's lovely to have you.
Hi Claire, it's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
So you have a full-time job in mental health. You also run your own mental health organisation called My Own Minds. And you're about to start a PhD around the help available for people with muscularity-oriented issues. So you're a very busy man. What motivates you to achieve so much in the field?
Well, to be honest with you, I think, I do a lot. Recently, I think I haven't been doing as much because my kind of full-time job in mental health has been so busy. I've had to kind of call back. So I feel like a bit of a fraud when you ask me that question, because the past couple of months, I haven't been doing that much, but maybe I'm also being kind of harsh on myself. But yeah, I guess as we'll talk about as we go on this podcast, a lot of the work that I do, so the mental health work I do is around eating disorders, and then my work with My Own Minds, I do a lot of stuff on this muscularity focused things and body dysmorphia, etc. And then obviously with my PhD, I'm going to be looking into muscularity oriented issues, and I also have my own lived experience with all of those things. So I think it's probably that underlying recognition of what it feels like to go through the things that I'm trying to help, that kind of makes me keep going, which sounds so cliche, but yeah, I think is the truth.
It's a very good reason to do what you do. Don't knock it. And why did you decide to share your story with the listeners of this podcast? Because you kindly volunteered to take part. We didn't have to come and hound you. Yeah,
I think partially because it's very rare that you come across people talking about the stuff that I have been through, especially the muscularity orientated stuff. A lot of my behaviors and kind of issues that I've had have been around wanting to be more muscular and wanting to kind of put on this persona of masculinity and being like the man in air quotes. And I think when people talk about that, I think partly because people are embarrassed by it or ashamed by it. I think especially it's difficult for guys to tend to talk about these kind of things. So I want to try and push that and maybe get more people to, if people listen to me, maybe they'll feel that they can share it as well. I've done lots of kind of panel shows and stuff, and I tend to be the guy, like the only man on the panel show, if it's about eating disorders or body dysmorphia or anything like that. So yeah, I guess I'm trying to help other people do this as well by doing this.
And what do you mean? I'm interested when you use this term muscularity-oriented issues. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I suppose there's two parts to it, 3 words, but 2 parts to it. The muscularity-oriented bit is, I suppose, the obvious bits. It's things that are orientated towards muscularity. They're in the kind of pursuit of muscularity. And an important kind of caveat in that is the use of muscularity is on purpose. It's not muscle or muscle mass or muscle size or anything like that, because muscularity encompasses both size and also definition. So, people who have muscle dysmorphia or muscularity-oriented disordered eating or anything like this, they don't necessarily have to be trying to get as big as possible, which is what I think most people tend to assume when they hear those kind of those words. But it can also be towards definition and being as lean as possible. And then the word issues was something. It seems kind of stupid because it's just a regular word, but I really had to think about it a lot as to what word I used. And I've gone with issues mostly because I think there's a lot of research on people who have high drive for muscularity, and the pursuit of muscularity and the pursuit of trying to be more muscular often has positive reasons behind it or positive kind of outcomes. There definitely are health outcomes that come from pursuing the extra exercise and you're doing certain things with your food and whatever. There are positives that come out from it. But the thing that I'm specifically interested in is when it crosses that line of when it's a problem and when it's not a problem. And that's where it kind of becomes difficult because for some people, I think for everyone, there are positives and negatives. I think people who get into the gym will get a whole load of positives that will come from it. So they'll feel better about themselves. They'll kind of get the endorphin rush that everyone talks about, and they'll maybe make some friends and all these other things. And they're really innately positive. But then at the same time, they might also be thinking, oh, if I stop doing this now, that might become a problem. I might lose my friends, or I might whatever, or they might, skip doing things that they would normally do. They might give up on other hobbies because, I want to go to the gym now instead. Sometimes that balance is fine. For some people, they can take on these behaviors and drop all these other things, and that's completely fine. But for some people, it's not. I think, I don't know if this is correct yet, but something I want to explore in my PhD is I think it's kind of like a scale in the sense that we have these different factors, negative and positive, kind of sit on a scale, and it tips one way or the other. And I think when it starts to tip towards negativity, that's when people tend to try and get help. And I actually recently read a paper, I think it was, the men who had sought help for, I think this was eating disorder specifically, but it was around muscularity anyway. They only sought help, or the kind of common thing that came up around when they would seek help was when they felt they lost control. So they thought they had this control and they had all these things going on. That was what it was in. It was in male athletes and looking at disordered eating specifically, but I think it accounts to all these other things as well. They tend to go hand in hand. And they all said that they kind of did it until the point they felt like they lost control. And I see that as that scale. They kept doing it until the point where that scale tipped too much towards that negative side. And then they started to seek help. Then it was a problem. Then it was a muscularity-oriented issue. And that's what I'm trying to understand is where that line is, and also like what can people do and what is available to people who cross that line.
That's very interesting. That also probably makes it relatively hard to answer the next question, which is around how widespread do you think these issues are? If it's hard to even spot the tipping point, it must be quite hard to identify how many people are affected.
It is very difficult. I think they're more widespread than we currently think. I think the research that I've seen is very little, partly because up until recently, there hasn't been too much to measure it in. So the scales haven't been that accurate yet. They kind of started to develop now and they're a bit better. But research is it tends to say, well, some research papers say it's in 1% of the population, and there's other ones that said 54%, and it spans massively. So we don't really know. There is a really recent paper that came out maybe early this year that I got sent recently, which was looking at people in the military. And they did, it was a big meta-analysis they had. So there was like over 40,000 participants in total. And they estimated around 15% of the men in the army had some form of muscle dysmorphia, and about 5% of the women. And I think there's a quote from, I think I'm sorry if I'm putting words in his mouth, but I think it's Rob Wilson, who works at the Body Dysmorphic Disorder Foundation. And I think he said in an interview somewhere that it was about 10% of gym goers in the UK have muscle dysmorphia or have some kind of symptoms of it.
Yeah. How would you describe the relationship you just mentioned, BDD there, the relationship between muscle dysmorphia and BDD?
I'm sure you've spoken about this on the podcast before, but when people get diagnosed with any kind of mental health issue, it's via the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, the version 5. And in that manual, body dysmorphic disorder is one of the kind of diagnoses. And muscle dysmorphia is what's called a specifier for body dysmorphic disorder. So if someone is diagnosed with body dysmorphic disorder, the doctor or psychiatrist or whoever's looking at this person can then also it's not like a drop-down menu, but like opens this drop-down menu of muscle dysmorphia, and then they tick off the other lists, which are they overly preoccupied with muscularity? Do they feel that they're less muscular than they actually are? Do they engage in excessive exercise and dieting in order to try and become more muscular, etc.? And if they also tick those boxes, then they can be diagnosed with muscle dysmorphia. So it is a form of body dysmorphic disorder, just a very specific version of it.
Are you comfortable with that method of diagnosis? Do you think that's sufficient, just out of interest?
I am and I'm not, because like, how else are we going to do it is part of my question. I don't think we have another method that we know works better. At least not that I've seen or heard. So I think we have to. it'd be great if we could come up with some kind of like, artificial intelligence or something that would never make a mistake and never have any kind of bias. But we know that there's bias. There's a paper, it's quite an old paper, and I don't think I've seen anything of recent that looked at this. But they basically got a case study of someone who had muscle dysmorphia. So like a proper diagnosed, like officially has muscle dysmorphia. And then they anonymized it. And then they gave this written case study to psychiatrists. And for one batch of the psychiatrists, they said, this is a man, read this case study. Do you think this person has muscle dysmorphia? And we know that they do. And only 50% of them correctly diagnosed them with muscle dysmorphia. And then they gave the same one to another bunch of psychiatrists and said, this is a woman with this case study. What do you think this is? And none of them correctly diagnosed them with muscle dysmorphia. So, and I think that's part that, well, that firstly shows an internal bias of women versus men. But it also shows this bias of, I think partly it's like not understanding that muscle dysmorphia is an option or that it's there. But then I also think this kind of leads on to what I think is a big area of interest of mine is in the world at the moment, in society, whatever you want to call it, muscularity equals health. And if someone has a six pack or has big arms or has veins or whatever, they're kind of, unless there's a line where people say, oh, it's too much or it's extreme when people get like really big. But there's definitely a wide berth there where it's just innately healthy. And I always tell this story about my own lived experience, but I once went into a GP practice and he said, oh, it looks on here like you've had some kind of things with eating disorders, something mentioned before. And then he looked at me and said like, oh, you don't look like you got an eating disorder. And he kind of flexed his arm and pointed it and we both kind of laughed. And I thought, yeah, obviously I don't, because like I've got muscles. But that was, we both had fully accepted and recognized that I can't have anything wrong with me because I go to the gym and I have muscles like that, and that's, I think, part of the issue with this. But again, like, if someone can come up with a better way of doing it, then but it's difficult.
It's very interesting because anorexia, again, there's quite a large section of sort of thinness that's considered a positive, isn't it, for women particularly? And it's only when you slip outside of that it starts to be viewed as problematic. And while you're in that skinny, kind of general skinny mode, you actually get a lot of people telling you how great you look, which is really not very healthy. But at the same time, anorexia is much more recognised. Why do you think that is?
I've got kind of a few points here. I'll start off with a little side note, which I just thought of when you were saying that. But again, a really interesting paper that people might be interested in. I think it was Scott Griffiths, if people want to look it up. Mm-hmm. I think it was like 2014 or something, but I'm pulling this out the air. So they looked at students' opinions of muscle dysmorphia and anorexia in people. And from what I remember, they asked hundreds of students what they felt about these two different kind of, well, I think it was four, because it was like a man and a woman with anorexia and then a man and a woman with muscle dysmorphia. But people always quoted they felt that the person with muscle dysmorphia was more capable of recovery. One was, they thought that person with muscle dysmorphia, they'd be less likely to approach them. And then there was another one. I can't remember right now, but those 2 points were really key there. So people feel like they don't want to approach people who have muscle dysmorphia. I guess partly it kind of links with that idea of they also think that they're more likely to recover. So I think people assume, again, because it's muscularity, and also I think it was more pronounced when they were men as well. Mm-hmm. So it's these muscular men. They must be all right. They must be able to sort themselves out. Like they look at them, they're muscular, so they're obviously going to be all right. Mm. And I think that's partly where this the lack of recognition comes in, is the fact that we assume that they'll be fine. Yes. So there's no point looking into it. And then I also think this kind of comes into the tie-in with masculinity. A lot of the research looking at muscularity show that masculinity tends to play a role. Usually it's this in the form of what they call masculine capital, which is basically this idea that you earn money by doing muscularity oriented stuff. That means that you're more masculine, and then you can spend that money in like social situations and be like, oh, I've got big arms, so you don't. Yeah, obviously not this literally, but mm-hmm. I get big arms, so you can respect me. So people try and kind of obtain that. And I think because it's tied into masculinity, I think one, the people who are experiencing it, so the men or women who are experiencing it, who are relying on masculinity, one of the kind of key things that we see for years in masculinity is that they don't want to seek help, that weakness is a problem. And that's one of the like really horrible things about masculinity at the moment, is that one of the toxic traits, as people like to call it, is that it encourages a lack of help-seeking behavior. So I think that's one of the reasons why people aren't aware of it, because people don't want to talk about it, because people who have it tend to think they need to be more masculine. So talking about it means they're less masculine. So it's like counterintuitive. It would be ridiculous for them to say it as far as they're concerned. And then I think on the other side of it, and I think this also plays in with the masculinity, people who are orientated towards muscularity oriented stuff, so muscle dysmorphia. One thing they tend to link with narcissism. So they tend to be, the kind of classic narcissistic, but it tends to be, there's kind of different specifiers of narcissism. So there's one that's called grandiose narcissism, which is the classic one where like someone's really cocky and thinks they're great and people don't like them. But then there's also this vulnerable narcissism, which is the idea of I'm so focused on myself because I'm scared that I'm not good enough, which is really commonly linked with muscle dysmorphia. So one thing, we see them as narcissists, so don't care about them. And two, they're seeking masculinity. They tend to also adhere to these like toxic masculinity trait, these kind of cocky and trying to be grandiose and trying to like fill up room and stuff. So again, they're not likable characters. So I think again, the idea of putting money into helping these people who are painted bad is going to be tricky. But that's partly why I want to do my research as well, is because I think, I'm sorry, I'm going off a tangent here, but I think it's really important that these men and women and anyone, I suppose, any kind of gender who is experiencing this and are tied in with masculinity, I think the current way that we're trying to solve that is telling them just to not adhere to masculinity anymore. But I see that as the same thing as like saying to someone with body dysmorphic disorder, like, oh, just stop looking at your body, or like saying to someone with depression, like, oh, why don't you look on the bright side of life, or like someone with eating disorder, like, oh, why don't you just eat a bit more or eat a bit less, or whatever it is. Like it doesn't work. Like you can't just tell someone not to do it. If it's internalized within them, you have to find ways around it and find ways through it. And I think that's what we're lacking at the moment. And I think, that's another reason why the prevalence isn't understood, because I think we're refusing to come up with the answer in some sense. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's really fascinating, but also very complex, isn't it? And there's so much social input there in a way, isn't there, in terms of perception, and the idea that it's hard to feel sympathy for a certain group of people, which is just really, it's a real shame, isn't it? That leaves some very vulnerable people even more vulnerable.
It's like steroids, people who adhere to these muscle dysmorphia and things. Steroids are really common. And people don't care about people who take steroids. Like if there are so many care groups and self-help and all sorts of stuff around people who take a lot of other drugs. There are some that are put in this category of we don't care, but if steroids are in this category of like, if you take them, you're purely doing it because you're a narcissist and you're full of yourself and you want to look good and you're a bit of a, like, I don't know if I'm supposed to swear, so I'm just going to say a not nice person. So therefore we'll just, we won't bother helping you. And again, it's that lack of sympathy that I think is being a real problem with this kind of population of people.
It's really clear, George, that you're incredibly knowledgeable about this topic. And it's also very clear that you've decided to kind of make this your life's work, haven't you? Are you able to tell us now the personal story behind that passion?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and keep this as brief as I can because there's a lot to it. But basically what happened was, so as I said, like similar to a lot of the research that I've quoted, I'm kind of the generic, I'm very much along those paths. My dad was an alcoholic, and he's not now anymore. He's been sober for like nearly 12 years now, and he's doing brilliantly. But I had a very kind of difficult childhood and upbringing, and I think it kind of manifested in me in this sense of I was the problem. Like I'm not good enough. I'm not what I'm supposed to be. And also my dad was very hardworking, and he was he was a big rugby player. He used to, he's got 2 big scars on his eyebrows because he used to split open every game he played. And he used to play with the adult team when he was 13. Like, he was like the local, like, hard as nails, like rugby person. And And I was always very sensitive. I always have been very sensitive. I've always been like empathetic, and I always think of others and always did things for others. And I guess I was always told that was okay. Like, you know, no one ever said like, you know, I was a wimp or anything like that. I suppose some people maybe did, but not that I remember. But at the same time, I was also kind of shown that it wasn't, because my dad got all this respect from being big and strong and enduring pain and working really hard and everything. And I didn't get that respect because I wasn't that. So I always I grew up kind of accepting that I wasn't what I was supposed to be in this kind of masculine sense. And one way that I decided that I would get that back was follow my dad's footsteps, and I took up rugby. So from, I think probably like 8 and probably even younger than that, like 7 years old, I played rugby, like started with tag and then went up to full contact. And then when I was 13, I had a fracture in my spine that broke when I was playing. And I ended up having to spend 9 months lying on the floor. I couldn't even lie on my bed because it was too soft and it hurt. And then about 3 months after that, so about 12 months in total, roughly, I was recovering from surgery I had. So I've got kind of metal in my back now holding it together. And during that year, I couldn't move, and I kind of emotionally ate quite a lot because the doctor said I couldn't play rugby, and you know, I didn't really see my friends, and I couldn't go to school and all these things. And I gained a substantial amount of weight. I won't do numbers because I don't think it's a good idea to do numbers. But I was significantly bigger than I was before I went in. And then when I went to school, you know, nobody outrightly bullied me or kind of picked on me that much. But I think, you know, when you're 15, no one's that subtle. No one's that kind of, so I kind of noticed that I'd lost the respect and lost this kind of, these friends how kind of close I was with friends. And I think partly it was just due to the time, but for me, I immediately attributed it all to the way my body looked and the fact that I wasn't able to be this kind of masculine thing anymore. So I started doing exercise and I started losing weight, and I started losing weight by running and like eating less or eating kind of quote unquote healthier foods. And I started to lose weight, and people started to like comment on it and kind of be proud of me for it. And I kind of earned this respect back. And I found that the more I lost weight, like the faster I did it, the more respect I got, and the more people were proud of me. So I kind of in my own head, what felt logically, thought, okay, well, I'll do more exercise and I'll eat less. And I just kept doing that until the point where I was barely eating anything and I was doing, you know, excessive amounts of exercise. And yeah, there was one point even where one of my doctors who worked on my surgery tried to get me to come in to teach his other patients how to lose weight like I did. Wow. Obviously I didn't do it, and you know, the doctor didn't know what was going on, but you know, I was getting that level of encouragement where my surgeon was like, you should come in and teach everyone how great you are. And then so then somewhere along the line, well, actually, I know what happened was I then started to kind of get into the fitness industry, and I thought, you know, I was 15, 16 years old, lost all this weight, really into like running and looking after my diet, so I thought anyway. I turned to social media and started looking at the fitness industry, and you know, every man in the fitness industry is big arms, 6-pack abs, veins, and massive. So I thought, oh no, I don't want to be skinny. I want to try and build muscle. So I started trying to build muscle, and then I read that you're supposed to eat more. And then in my head, I thought, oh well, what I'll do to eat more. So I want to eat more to gain weight, to gain muscle, but I don't want to eat more because then I'll gain body fat. So I thought, oh, a good way to get around this. Again, completely illogical. But I thought, okay, I'll eat it and then I'll make myself sick. And then I could get the best of both worlds as far as I thought. And obviously I now know, and for everyone out there, that doesn't work and it's not a good idea. But I thought it was at the time. And then kind of, I guess time went on, and this all kind of was combined with like depression and anxiety and struggling with going to school and, you know, ups and downs. Obviously my dad was an alcoholic still and struggling, and that kind of met its kind of head, I suppose, at similar time to when this all happened. So that kind of was difficult. And then when I kind of went to uni, I stopped making myself sick when I went to uni about halfway through my first year. And I think partly it was due to, like, I guess I was a bit embarrassed, and it just kind of made sense to me that, oh, I shouldn't do this anymore because people might catch me or something. For some reason, it just kind of went, which is, I don't really know how it did so magically, but it did. And but I just kept binge eating. So I'd still do the binge eating. And I kind of had what I think people would say was binge eating disorder. I was obsessed with the gym still. I spent every single day in the gym. I'd wake up, my room was about, 20 meters from the gym. I'd go into the gym, I'd do a workout, I'd come home, I'd shower, I'd go back into the gym, I'd study there, I'd train whilst I was studying. And then so I literally was just like the whole of my first year was spent in the gym. Occasionally I would have binging episodes because I was just severely restricting and exercising so much. So my body just craved so much food and I would just binge. And then I'd kind of stay in my room and not do anything for like a week and then come out and stuff. But it wasn't until my second year where it got really bad and where I hadn't left my room for about 2 weeks. I'd just been ordering food. Like the only time I'd left the room was to go to the toilet or to go and get food from my door that I'd been ordering. So I'd spent like ridiculous amounts of money on pizzas and stuff. And luckily one of my best mates at uni, she came to my house and she said like she was worried about me, and I opened up to her and told her what's been going on. And then she encouraged me to go see a counsellor. So I started to see a counsellor. The counsellor, the kind of talking therapy is what saved me and what kind of helped me. Because, I think I didn't really mention this, but when during those 2 weeks and during before my friend came to see me, I kind of got the closest to, I was very far along the suicidal behavior kind of checklist. And I'd started like imagining how I'd do it and practicing it and things. And I got to a really dark place. And then luckily my friend came and I started seeing a counselor, and that's what really helped me. And sorry, I was getting a bit emotional there. But then I started seeing my counselor, and what we did together, a lot of it was around this idea that I was always lying and always trying to portray this other version of me. So I needed to show that I don't need to be ashamed of this real me, this version of me that's underneath it. So we started off just kind of sharing little things like, if someone asks me how I am, don't just say you're okay. Like if you aren't feeling that great, or if you're nervous or whatever, tell someone that. And as I did that, I started to realize that people don't actually care if you just tell the truth about how you feel. And in fact, people tend to like it, because then normally it would go, hi, how are you? And they'd say they're fine. And then I'd say, oh, maybe I'm not actually not that great. And then they'd say, actually, yeah, to be honest, neither am I. And then we'd talk about that and it'd be a good thing. And that kind of went up over time, to the point where I started talking about the problems I had with my eating and the way I view my body and my exercise. And I spoke to my gym friends and my kind of fellow athletes, and I found that like 90% of them said, oh yeah, I have that too. And like everyone, I'd say probably 100% of the people I spoke to, I'm sure it's not 100% of actual people, but all the ones I spoke to had a similar thing. And that's when I started Myo Minds. Originally Myo Minds was this like Instagram account that people could share their stories on. So people would share their stories to show both sides of it. And I'm not trying to denounce any of these behaviors, because like I said before, I think they are inherently healthy, but it's just this other side to it. But yeah, so now kind of fast forwarding, I've talked for too long now, but fast forwarding, I've kind of done more work with a counsellor, and I'm still not perfect. Like I still struggle. If I'm honest, I've been struggling this last month or so. Mm-hmm. Just with kind of the way I'm viewing my body, and I've been a bit ill, and I kind of struggle with that as well. And I think part of me has moved my masculinity away from my body and now towards productivity. So if I now kind of get a little bit of my masculinity from I'm productive all the time. And what I'm working on is trying to, instead of having a pillar, so everything's focused on being productive or being muscular, I'm trying to build the pyramid. So the bottom is built up of all these different things where I can get self-worth from. And then if one of them doesn't work, I've got all these other things. And that's where I am now.
During the course of your counselling then, would you say that you had any real light bulb moments where you suddenly found something that was incredibly helpful that you hadn't thought of before?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few. I'll highlight 3 of them. So the first one, I think I've already kind of spoken about, which is the value in honesty has been a huge thing for me. I think, people always say that, and this will kind of lead on to one of my other ones, but people always say that honesty is like the best policy and you should always be honest and things. But I always kind of thought it was a bit of like a cliche. Like I was, I think being around my dad as well when I was a kid, and he was obviously with his alcoholism, there was all kind of a lot of lying going on there a lot of the time. I used to always think people say you're supposed to be honest, but then people don't actually do it because no one would actually be honest. So that's not the way you do it. So I think a big thing for me was learning that if you're actually honest about how you feel, and I think anyone who knows me now will know that I am like an oversharer to the point where, if you ask me how I am, I'll tell you exactly how I am. And yeah, I think that it's got to the point now where I think if I tell any lie, I feel it. Like I feel it in my core. Sometimes I'll accidentally lie. It'll just kind of come out, or I'll tell it. I think white lies are maybe different, but when it's like an important thing, it kind of hurts me to my core, where I just realize that's like a real problem. I need to not do that again. I think that's been a really big point for me is try and be actually as honest as you possibly can be. Like, I think you kind of align yourself, like I think you teach, whenever you lie about something, you teach yourself that your actual opinion isn't as valuable as you think it is, or something along those lines anyway. And then that kind of leads me on to my next point, with the whole honesty as the policy thing, is around cliches. I think I always used to think anything that everyone said must be a load of crap, like mustn't be true. Like, the fact that people say like, oh, you should always talk to people, that always helps, or it's okay to not be okay, or, I guess like control what you can control and don't worry about things you can't control, and all these things that everyone would say. But I think one thing I've tried to kind of catch myself on now is I think the reason things become a cliche often is because there's a lot of wisdom in them, and there's actually like a reason behind everyone saying them. Some of them maybe not, but I think at least, I try and cut some slack with cliches now and actually investigate them. I think that was a really important point for me. And the third, and probably the most important one for me, was finding out what my values were, like what I actually valued in my life. Like, what is it that actually makes me happy and is important to me? And then looking at how I was living my life and whether that actually adhered to it. So I realized that having knowledge is really important to me, but all I was doing was going to the gym, and I was tiring myself out and not eating enough, that I was tired and things, and I thought, I need to change that because I want to adhere to these things that I value. I value having time with friends and having interesting conversations, so I need to keep up speaking to friends even when I don't feel like it, and finding these things that I actually value. And I think more time than not, if you actually look into what it is you value in your life and then look at your life, especially if you're not feeling great, you'll find that it's because you're not doing the things that make you happy. Like, you're not valuing your values. So I think that's a really good kind of exercise to do, is like, look into what it is you value and then orientate your life towards that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we talked about this when I chatted to you before, that actually looking at your values is quite a big part of BDD, sort of the classic CBT now, BDD approach for BDD. And often, people who are struggling with sort of anything relating to sort of body image or self-image will be living by a set of values that aren't actually very healthy. So there's also a kind of process of rewriting those values and for things that are more balanced, give you a more balanced view of your own worth. So that's really interesting. I also find it interesting what you say about cliches, because actually a lot of cliches go back to the wisdom of the ancients, don't they? Like, so that thing about only worry about things you can control is like Stoicism, which is ancient Greeks and stuff. So actually there is real value in it. And that's why they're cliches, because they've been with us for 2,000 years. What's next for you then? You've mentioned a couple of times your PhD. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what that's looking into?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently, we've just submitted an application for some funding. So I'm currently on the fence of whether I'm going to be doing it part-time or full-time. If I get the funding, I'll do it full-time. But basically what we're looking into is it's going to be a 2-part study. The first part, I'm going to be looking at what care is available for people who have muscularity-oriented issues. So I'm looking for this PhD, I'm going to be looking mostly at men, purely because it seems to be most common in men, and to do it in everyone would be a study that's beyond a PhD level amount of data. So I'm going to focus on men. So what I'm going to be doing is looking at the kind of the documents that are available in NHS services and other like third party services, charities, or what are they called? Third sector. That's the one.
Yes, that's the one. Yeah.
Third sector services. and seeing what's actually available for people who have muscularity oriented issues. To see, if they're mentioned in documents anywhere, if staff get trained in it, if if there's actually like a course specifically for people with muscularity oriented stuff like muscle dysmorphia, muscle oriented disordered eating, etc. And then hopefully create like a map, like a visual representation of what's there and what's missing, and also then help guide organizations and policy changes to try and fill these gaps and help this population of people. And then the second half of the study, I'm going to kind of do the reverse. So I'm looking at, so first half is looking at what's available, and the second half is looking at the people who are going to seek it. So I want to look at the relationship between help-seeking behavior and muscularity-oriented issues. So the people who have muscularity-oriented issues, why is it that they don't seem to seek help? And I've spoken about it on this podcast, and they're my kind of ideas, and they're backed up by different research papers. But no one's actually specifically looked at that exact question and tried to figure out what this relationship looks like in people. So I want to interview people who are struggling with muscularity-oriented stuff, issues, and try and figure out how they feel about help-seeking behavior. What's the kind of path they've been through, how it relates to masculinity, how it relates to kind of their feelings of themselves, how it relates to feelings of others, all these kind of things, and try and get an understanding, so that then again I can try and come up with some guidelines for companies that are wanting to try and help these people, of what to do, like how to change the way they are, or how to do outreach, what we can do in society to try and help these people.
So you're hoping, so you mentioned companies there, you're hoping that companies could use this guidance, but also NHS, are you thinking, like, what's the application? Yeah,
so there's actually been two really big changes recently. There's the Royal College of Psychiatrists have come out with two things. So the first one is the new Mead guidelines, and I submitted a consultation as MyoMinds through First Steps to try and ask them to integrate muscularity into these new Mead guidelines. The Mead guidelines are basically a management of, I forget the real wording, it's basically the emergency managing of people with eating disorders, people who are like really ill with eating disorders, like how to help with them. So guidelines for all services to use. And I submitted an application to say they should include muscularity in there and mention it specifically, so that doctors in services who've never heard of it recognize that even if a patient's presenting with like big muscles or looks athletic, they could also still be struggling with this, and also to mention steroids and things like that. And I didn't get confirmation whether it was due to my consultation, but they didn't have it in. And then when they've actually released it now, they do have it in. So that's a really great positive, even if it wasn't due to my consultation. But
fantastic, yeah,
that's really positive. And then also the QED, which is the Quality Network for Eating Disorders at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, they assess eating disorder services across the UK. And they've recently redone their standards for community services, so services that work with people who are out of hospital. And they've put in a standard that services should train their staff in atypical presentations of eating disorders. So, and that in brackets, it includes muscularity orientated. So again, I think there are changes being placed, and it's stuff like that I'm hoping this research can accelerate. So those are the first two things in the UK, at least, to ever mention muscularity in that sense. It might even be the world, but I'm not sure. But it's huge either way. Yeah. I want my PhD to help accelerate that in other domains, and so that's kind of the plan, I guess.
Well, I mean, fantastic! You've already had some wins before even starting the PhD. Yeah. So well done. I wanted to just end by asking you a couple of questions that were designed to kind of help other people, I guess, who've experienced similar things to you or related things to you. And the first thing, which I'm so interested in, is what you say about this, the relationship between men not seeking help for their issues and the kind of ongoing pressure from society to be masculine. So what would you say to someone who's really struggling with that contradiction?
Yeah, and it is very difficult. I think people who rely on masculinity are kind of stuck. As I said before, I think we've mostly labeled masculinity as this. It's either a joke or a threat. It's something to laugh at, oh, look at him, he thinks he's like the shit. Oh, sorry, swearing. Yeah, isn't he funny? Isn't that funny? What, like, yeah, we hate him. Or it's a threat. And rightly, and I'm not trying to denounce that. Like, sometimes it is funny and sometimes it is a threat. Like, sometimes it really is problematic. But I think coating everyone who relies on masculinity with that brush can be a problem. So, like I said before, we're basically telling them to stop relying on masculinity, which is the same as telling, like, someone with depression to look on the bright side of life or whatever. So I think really what we need to look at, and my advice for people who are struggling with this kind of difficulty and feeling stuck, is I think it's okay to want some masculinity and to rely on it in some sense. Again, build that pyramid, come up with other things as well. But it's what's instead is lean into that masculinity, but find positive forms of it that are beneficial to you and to your life and to the world. So, instead of having to be the center of attention and this kind of the stoic figure of a person, instead, why don't you work on being so assured with who you are that you don't care what other people looking up to you or whatever, because you're just being you, and that's okay. And instead of, again, from the stoicism, I think you can take certain aspects of it that are good and certain aspects that aren't so good. I don't necessarily know if I'm not massively well read on stoicism. I've been reading more of it recently to try and understand it for my PhD, but I think the sides of it of control the things that are in your control are great. I think they're really positive. The idea that you try and forget about other people's reactions to the things that you do, just do things that are like important and meaningful and true and right and virtuous, I suppose, as they would say. But then on the other side, I guess the connotations that are with stoicism now of ignoring your emotions and not talking about them, I think maybe they aren't necessarily correct. Whether, again, I don't know if the Stoics actually did encourage that, because I'm not as well read in it as I know.
I think it's maybe something that's happened over the course of the centuries, the sort of redefining of what it means. But I'm not really an expert in all by any accounts. It's just something that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, but I suppose that's the like you say, it's the current redefinition of stoicism, isn't it? So that redefinition, I think, is incorrect. Like, I don't think that works. Like, I just don't think it helps. And that's, again, this is a dangerous topic. I've already spoken for a long time, but it's something that gets me going for a lot. But it's really interesting that these men who, or any kind of gender, I think, who rely on masculinity, because that's really important here as well. Is, I think when we say masculinity and femininity, we think male and female or men and women, but masculinity and femininity are concepts. Everyone is masculine and everyone is feminine in different levels. It doesn't matter what gender you are or anything. Like I'm not talking about men when I say masculinity. I'm not talking about women when I say femininity. I think the men, like men who, and women and anyone who's relying on masculinity and then a kind of takes on muscularity orientated stuff, they tend to, like myself, lean into the fitness community. And the values of the fitness community and the values of masculinity, at least the ones that are kind of been highlighted in the research, I've noticed are almost perfectly aligned. They're both about having a muscular body is beneficial in both of them. They both talk about working really hard, and the amount of work ethic you put in is beneficial to your fitness values or also to your masculinity values. They also both talk about enduring pain. Being able to endure a lot of pain is positive in both of them and is a value in both of them. And also they both talk about the idea that your like mind and body will want you to stop, but it's your responsibility as a man, in air quotes, or as a fitness fanatic, in air quotes, it's your responsibility to ignore your mind and body and keep going anyway. And because that's what you're supposed to do as a good fitness person or as a good masculine person. And my kind of problem with that is, how am I supposed to know, as someone who's relying on those values, how am I supposed to know when an emotion is one that I'm supposed to ignore and push through because that's what I'm responsible of doing, and one that I'm supposed to seek help for, and actually find help. And there is no line there, and it's different for everyone. And that's a problem. Like, that's really a problem. And that's a problem I really want to try and solve. And I don't know the answer. But I think even just highlighting that to people might help with it, to recognize that you don't know where that line is, but there is a line there somewhere. And maybe look into that. If you're feeling something that doesn't feel great, maybe look into where that line is, because there definitely is one. I don't care who you are. There's a line somewhere that says this is something you need to seek help for. So look into that.
It's like self-awareness is the first step, and then the awareness of the rest of the world is almost the second step, isn't it? So you need to actually be able to spot those dangerous signs, or those signs that you're slipping into something less healthy.
It is something that's really important.
Definitely. So for my last question, I just wanted to, just thinking about the listeners of this podcast, get your thoughts again on, we've talked about it slightly earlier, but about that link between BDD and the sorts of issues that you're talking about, and what you would want to say to people listening who are diagnosed with BDD. Is there anything you would take from your experience that you think you could apply to theirs?
I guess one thing we spoke about before, when we spoke before the podcast, was I think the relationship between body dysmorphic disorder and kind of issues with eating and exercise are really kind of close. I think it's kind of a stereotypical thing that happens, at least when I speak to clinicians at services and stuff. I think they often always talk about this kind of the very fine line between body dysmorphic disorder and eating disorders. And I think it's the same with exercise addiction. Often people who have some form of body dysmorphic disorder do also, they try and find a way to fix it, in air quotes again, or try to help themselves with this problem that they think they have. And yeah, I guess maybe for me, understanding all three components of that was really important to my kind of recovery. And I think if I just focused on the way I view my body, I think the eating and exercise would keep it there. And whereas I think because I took that 3-pronged approach to all three, it's really important. I'm not trying to be diagnosing anyone. Like I'm sure, but I'm just saying, I guess, again, like, look into it. Well, I think it's something to investigate, is to consider how much you're relying on your exercise and your eating, as well as the way you're perceiving your body. And I think, trying to find a positive way of viewing. So, like for me, I guess I have like ways that I do each of the three now. With exercise, I try and exercise with the goal of like performance rather than the way I look. So my exercises now, everything I do is tailored towards trying to be stronger or trying to be better at sport that I do. And then with food, I try, and my general rule of thumb is I eat in a way that doesn't make me feel like crap, which is like loads of food that, makes me feel like lethargic and whatever. But I also don't eat like so little food or so overly clean, in air quotes again, food that I feel like tired and bored and, like crap in that sense. So I eat somewhere in that middle, and I get it wrong all the time. Sometimes I eat a bit too much of something that makes me feel a bit queasy, and then sometimes I don't eat enough, and then I'm like, oh, and then you figure it out and you get it wrong all the time, and that's okay. And then the same with my body, I try and treat my body in the way that I perceive my body in a way that doesn't make me feel like crap as well, in the sense that I don't try and hide away from it to the point where I'm just like, scared of looking at myself. But I also recognize that sometimes I look at it too much, and I'll start relying on body checking and things too much. And I try and find that one in the middle. But again, I think these behaviors, as I'm sure everyone who listens to this, or a lot of the people who listen to this podcast know, a lot of these things tend to be a manifestation of something underneath. There tends to be something underneath. And I think working on those other things with counseling or with work or with whatever, I think is the key to finding that balance. But yeah, I guess it's just something to be wary of.
Thanks a million, George. That's been such an interesting conversation. I've really liked chatting to you, and thanks very much for bringing a new perspective to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been
my
great.
pleasure. Thank you. Thanks again to George for sharing his experiences and wealth of knowledge about muscularity-oriented issues. To hear more episodes, just search for Beating BDD on major podcast apps and on Spotify. You can also leave us feedback by following the BDD Foundation on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube and Facebook. I'll be back with another interview as soon as I can, Until then, a reminder that this podcast isn't therapy, so please do seek help from a trained professional. Thanks for listening.